Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar of our contract milking series. My name's Louise Gibson. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor from Federated Farmers. I've got three guest speakers tonight. I've got Ash and Joshua from FMG, who are going to talk us through the insurances that are required in our contract, but also some other ones you should consider as part of your business for this coming season. And Nick from Rabobank, who's going to talk through some of the special things we need to consider as contract milkers and farm owners for our contract milkers, and some really good advice on banking. And I'll wrap it up with just some kind of tick list things to get us through to next season. So for now, I'm going to just give you some advice on the Q&A. We're going to have Q&A right at the end. You'll see there's a question and answer box at the bottom. Pop your questions in there. If we don't get to them tonight, we will do a follow-up email in the next few days. It'll have the webinar recording link, and as well as a handout with some of the messages from this evening. So let's start with Ash from FMG.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Ash, and so today Josh and I will be talking about the sort of contractual obligations within your contracts and just things to sort of look out for when you're going into the season, or even when you're sort of starting to sign that contract. So contractual obligations are duties that both farm owner and contract milker and share milker are legally responsible for in a contract agreement. It is important for both parties to really follow the sides, of the contract, look at the consequences, understand the, sort of breaches, and really be familiar with the clauses within it. So our role today is just to really raise awareness on some sort of some areas within the contract. But if you are confused and if you are concerned with some sort of clause in there, or I don't understand bits in it, please seek some legal advice, because the best thing to do is to get some clarity around the contract that you're signing. So I'll pass it over to Josh for the next slide, and he'll take you on.
Evening, everyone. So just the way FMG looks at our advice here, or our insurance, is we break it down into the three buckets, as you can see on screen there. So I'm going to cover those physical risks, which are those things that you can see around the tractor fires, around your milk, building fires, things like that. And then that second bucket around the operational risk, which are those things that can really affect your business or sink your business. And we'll touch on those as we go through. And I'll leave that third bucket, that key person risk, for Ash to cover off as he comes in to finish the presentation on FMG's behalf. We'll just, on the next slide here, we'll see what the insurance section of the contract is, and what it does look like. So item 29 in there. And this is something that you will work through as you kind of work through your contracts. You'll work through the different values and all the default values that are in there, and you'll cover those off. And it's really good to have those covered off with yourself and the farm owner, to make sure that you're both on exactly the same page there. As we're working through, we'll just work through each section. So on the next slide there, we'll see public liability, which is, covers your damage caused to third parties through accidental negligence. So probably one of our most of our claims are based around stock getting on the road, and that's because someone's accidentally left the tape on the ground or forgot to shut the tank track gate, and stock have got down the road. The key word there is you have to actually be found negligent or at fault. If it's just an accident, your cows have jumped the fence, you can't actually be held at fault there. Minimum requirements, $2 million there, and that's what we recommend. But if you are bounding a main highway or next to train tracks, or you're close to town, there's a factory next door, those are the kind of things that we look for, or you guys should think about, to maybe potentially look at lifting your public liability cover. Often there can be contracts around that do state minimum liability requirements, and farm owners should have a copy of that or have access to that somehow. Another part of the liability on the next slide is our statutory liability. So that covers against accidental breach of acts of Parliament. So the main concerns for you guys will be around that Resource Management Act. So that fits in and around kind of effluent breaches, and around the waterways and the way things are moving there. So it's key word is accidental there, which we would kind of work through with you guys and our team to play that all out. Your health and safety, as you work through the contract, you'll see that in there. But just a quick thing to note, insurance-wise, we will not cover, we cannot legally cover your fine if you do end up with a fine around that health and safety. So that's why it's really, really important to make sure you keep that up to spec. But those in the Animal Welfare Act on the end there, those are the kind of 3 key acts that are key to dairy farming. There is a minimum requirement of 500k, which does seem like a lot, but once you get legal costs, there's legal costs, reparations, court costs all involved, that 500k does look to disappear quickly if you do end up in that situation. And then below you can see the reasons for having a high sum insured there. So whether you've got a lot of staff that are working under you, so with the high health and safety risks, or you're boundarying a river or waterway, and those are the things that can really affect what you kind of cover you would want for that statutory liability. Moving through to the next slide, probably the big one or the key one, kind of for everyone on here, is your milk spoilage and contamination. So there is a little bit of a common misconception there. We work it on the milk in the vat, so there's not just a standard figure. So if you're operating a big 16,000 litre vat, would work on what your loss would be there, or if you're on a 9,000 litre vat, then would work on what your maximum loss would be there. And noting you may not fill it, the vat in a day, but you could be on every second day pickup, so it's your maximum loss. The cover, covers if your vat doesn't make it to the vat, you forget to turn your vat tap on, you forget to turn the chiller on, you accidentally put a penicillin can, milk penicillin can to the vat. All of those instances are covered. There is a difference between farm owner and contract milker or share milker. You both do need the cover. There is different instances there. So your farm owner is responsible for the maintenance of the plant, generally, just speaking generally here. So any plant failure is on the farm owner, but any operational failure generally falls to the contract milker and share milker. So that's why both farm owner and contract milker need that cover. The other key point to note is you're limited to 2 spoilage and contaminations claims per year. And that's with the technology now, in terms of, cow monitoring, treatment monitoring, and obviously Halo, Levno, or whatever's on your vat monitoring system, the chance of damage or loss is a lot lower. So we have limited that to 2 claims per year. Looking in the next slide here, you can see actually where a lot of those claims do come from, and our stats there. So there's $14 million of claims paid out there over a 5-year period, and for all those different examples, so you can see where some of those claims do come from. Furthermore, if you're the next slide, we'll look at, you can see if the milk is contaminated in the vat and it ends up contaminating others' milk in the tanker or at the silo. So there's a couple of things there. So you're looking at potentially a fine for contaminating the tanker, the cleanup cost of the tanker, and then also potential or silo at the factory, and then also covering the loss to others' milk you do get fined for. So this will be filled out in your contract as well, but the maximum fine that Fonterra has is $500,000 per event, and open country is $1 million. But we recommend if you do supply any of those other suppliers, just jump in their supplier's handbook, and that should give you an indication of where they sit or what they recommend you should have. Your local FMG manager should also know where that sits at. So that'll really help you there. That's limited to 500k or $1 million per year or per season. So there's plenty there, and would be worried if you're getting that high. A standard tanker claim for us sits around that 40 to 50k, but if you do end up in the factory, it can end up a lot higher depending on how far through the system it gets. Looking at the next slide, as a contract milker or share milker with staff in on-farm houses now, you now become a landlord. And as part of that contract, there's the tenancy agreement in there. So as a contract milker or share milker, the biggest requirement for you guys there is to do your house inspections and keeping them tidy. And from an insurance point of view, just making sure that you keep up with the frequency that the insurer of the houses does kind of require or does ask of you. For us, we're every 6 months, but just check with your farm owner how often it should be done, and vice versa as a farm owner. Kind of work back the other way and kind of signal how many times a year it's got to be done. Just make sure that you do document your checks as well. So that can be in different ways, whether you use a tenancy check form, your email follow-up with the notes on it, or you just take a few photos and send that an email or save that to a file. It just shows that it has been done there and it is documented. So if there is damage come the end of your season, you can refer back to that and work through that. On to the next slide. A probably rather larger question there, and this is a really good one to speak to with your farm owner as well. What would plan B look like if there was a dairy shed fire and there was a total loss there, or a flood come through the shed? Currently those in Northland and around Auckland, fingers crossed it's not you at the moment, or even a bridge providing access to the property. So it's something for you probably to discuss or think about, because if you're unable to milk through your shed, it does obviously limit your income. Can't milk your cows. You've got some animal welfare issues there potentially. So it is something that we can offer cover on, is to replace that milking check for you as such, and that will allow you to financially continue, which may be touched on later on, but it'll give you that financial security to make it through to the end of the season, in terms of continuing to pay staff, meet debts, and obviously still feed the family. With the biggest key to this being, everyone says we can use the neighbour's shed to work through a scenario like this, and you can kind of work in with them, but it's not as easy as it seems. And just check with your neighbour. It may be worth asking them that question as well. Even with your bridge and access into the property as well, just make sure that that is insured, because if the shed, the dairy shed, or the access bridge isn't insured, then this business interruption policy won't respond. But it's a great protection for your income, especially if you're first year in that contract milking role, or share milking and holding a bit of debt. It guarantees at least you're going to be able to meet your budgets and to what you thought about or work through with your bank manager, as to what you need. On that note, I'll pass the remainder of the slides over to Ash.
Thanks, Josh. So yeah, today we'll just be looking at that sort of people part of the contractual obligations, and also looking at the business continuation part on the revenue and how the business sort of continues, sort of highlighting some key areas within your contract to look out for. So just on the next slide, we'll be talking about sort of the share milkers contract and the contract milkers agreement of 2023. So in the next, that's Federated Farmers one, and the next one, just looking at more on your obligations. So part of the agreement, there are some set out sort of obligations. First obligation is your responsibility as a share milker or contract milker, which you are contractually obligated within the contracts to replace labor. So that is to replace labor due to either sickness or injury, and a point of, next week you've entered into the contract and you become sick and injured, you've got a legal responsibility within the contract to ensure that you replace your labor, and that labor has to have a degree of competency. So these sort of clauses can be found on page 14 of the share milkers contract and page 24 of the contract milkers contract. The agreement. So yeah, part of the responsibility is to make sure, one is, you understand part of that, those clauses and those sort of obligations within it. As I mentioned at the start, if you do need more clarity, please seek legal advice. And it's important to, when I talk about that sort of responsibility with a degree of competency, you're replacing your labor with, that competency is quite important. So in sort of, when we look at in the sort of current market, it's quite hard to hire a competent labor, or it does cost quite a premium wage to hire someone. So having a incompetent replacement could potentially, hold the contract milker or the share milker liable for damages, within the contract if that incompetent person has caused damages. So to ensure that you understand your contract here, please read through it and see that sort of headings within it. What a competent labor is compared to a incompetent. It does sort of state it out. So have a look through it. A contract milker or a share milker. When I talk about if you did become sick and injured, unfortunately, you cannot work on the farm. You've now either seeking rehabilitation or getting better, and you can no longer work on the farm. So as it can be, there will be a drop in production because you're unable to be on farm. So it's really important, especially during the sort of busy seasons, to ensure you've got a contingency plan behind it to make sure that these responsibilities on the farm are taken care of, and that your business really just continues and allows the production to continue as well. So both farm owner and share milker need to be aware of these clauses and or what the impact of sort of, would be if there is non-compliance, or if things happen on the farm that you weren't, that made you obligated to pay out. The breach part of the agreement is, which sort of deals with the sort of damages, and for the share milkers contract is page 32. And the contract milkers agreement is page 61. So that's just to highlight the sort of areas where for you to sort of read through and see where it talks about what would happen if there is a breach of these sort of agreements. And so yes, yet again, please do seek legal advice if you are confused about these things. So in the next slide, over here, sort of when we look at replacement labor and how do we sort of meet these obligations, and it was part of the contract, so you are obligated. So it's just sort of looking at some solutions. There are some potential solutions that you have to have in plan, which one is when I talked about that contingency plan. So it's sort of knowing what would happen tomorrow if you became sick and injured and you had to replace labor and the business did have to continue. So it's sort of setting out, what sort of things you can have in place. One is, I guess, having a competent manager that's below you, so allowing them to take over if you were sick and injured. Now, in today's sort of market, that does become quite hard to. One is to have a competent manager working alongside you. So I can understand that it can be quite tough. The other part is to sort of have your own cash flow. So that's having a large sort of deposit in a bank set aside for these sort of contingencies. If you became sick and injured and you couldn't work, but you had to replace labor, you had to fulfill your contract by having some sort of cash flow in there. Yet again, I know that can be hard when you're sort of starting a business. One solution that we see a lot of farmers take up, and it is something in an insurance form, which is key person cover. So as FMG, we do offer key person cover. Now, what key person cover sort of does is it's unlike most businesses, a farm cannot sort of afford to operate in the event of loss of a key worker due to sort of sickness and injury. So a key person cover allows you to replace a sick or injured person. Therefore, just to keep the farm ticking over, it is a much better solution than rather than making sure you've got enough cash in the bank and allowing or having a competent manager working alongside you. So key person cover will pay you a monthly sum to your business to ensure that the main person who was injured, the key person in the business, is able to recover without any sort of financial stress, without any sort of stress that as the business is going to continue. So it gives them rehabilitation without any other stress around, and makes them focus on their injury or their illness. But also in the background, it allows the business to continue, and it allows the contract to be fulfilled. It allows, that in a way of one is to meet that agreement, to allow you to pay that premium when it comes to hiring a competent person, but also gives you the solution to sort of meet that contractual obligation, which I mentioned earlier on. So key person cover is by far one of the solutions that it is taken up, or we see taken up, because we do offer that cover. And on the next slide, sort of, we talk about what would cost to replace labor, and this is just an example of what it would in today's sort of average, how much it would really cost if you to have something like that saved in the bank as a contingency can be tough, or having a plan around how you're going to come up with that money to borrow money or whatever it is. It can be tough to sort of have that contingency plan. So by having a key person cover is probably a solution where you can nominate. If your farm production is at that level, we can nominate an amount which is sufficient to replace that labor and how much it costs to make sure that monthly income comes in and allows you to. And as you know, we do see a lot of or comments around that it is unlikely it's going to happen to me, and unfortunately, yeah, so it does happen a lot. In the next slide, when we look at work safe statistics, this sort of shows in the agricultural industry over the last 12 months, you look at there's been 1,000 injuries, and this is only injury focused. So you look at the times when it did happen is in the middle of or the start of calving. It's probably one of the worst times that could happen. So it puts a lot of businesses into jeopardy in terms of how does it continue? How do you continue your business and keep going? So that's where key person cover can come in and allow you to pay that premium to hire that person in that sort of busy time as well. And in the next slide, when we look at it, away from the injuries, it sort of focuses a lot more on. So these are statistics from Fidelity, which is a insurance provider. And these are some stats that they've provided for us to sort of look at. We look 32% of the claims that they had were cancer related. We got 13% was cardiovascular, and we know we've been hit with that, the pandemic, and you see that illness does come along, and unfortunately, there isn't a contingency behind it. So that's where we look at key person. It allows the key person or the farmer to recover, get better, and focus on their treatment, focus on their rehabilitation, but allowing their business to continue. So yet again, a big sort of example of that things does happen. And on the next slide is probably a big example of when we look at these are the Southern Cross claims, and in the agriculture, forestry, and the fishing industry, it's about 31,357 claims that have gone through Southern Cross. So Southern Cross is a health insurance provider. So this is more focused on insurance, private insurance, which allows you to get better, allows you to it pays for your treatments and allows you to do the surgeries or the rehabilitation or the diagnostic testing. So when we look at our specialist consultations, we've had 5,034 consultations over the last 12 months to figure out if there is an issue with our agricultural, forestry, or fishing industry. So from that, we've had, surgery of 2,897. So it just shows that how often these things can happen, and to make sure that it is part of your contract that to replace labor. So just to have a contingency behind it. And yeah, that's it from me, Louise.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ash. All right. I know I've got one question in, but if you do have any more questions for Josh and Ash, can you pop them in the Q&A box for the end? We are going to now jump to Nick from Rabobank.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Slightly scary looking side on. I've just realised I've got a lot less hair than I thought I had, but either way, look, I'm going to just provide a bit of background and I suppose higher level observations on contract milking and my career in banking, what I've noted, I suppose, through the last 17 odd years. So my role in Rabobank is area manager of the Canterbury Tasman region, the top half of the South Island. And of course, Rabobank, we're the only agricultural specialist bank in New Zealand. And it's important because obviously there's a range of different banks, and I'm not talking specifically about Rabo, but you do get into areas with some crossover in what we call retail banking, which can include housing, most specifically when we talk about contract milking and younger industry participants or entrants. So I just wanted to make that clear at the outset, but perhaps we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a bit of context. As I said, it's really only one opinion, my opinion, and a set of observations from one banker who's been in the game for a while. And I've just noted there that it's not about the bank. This isn't necessarily about us. And I've been at a different bank prior to this for a long time as well. So, back in the old days, I refer to old days, I'm 47, so it's not that long ago. But there was really only sort of three options in getting started before you got into traditional 50-50 share milking. And I'm sure you're all aware of this, but it used to be a case of being a 19, 21 or 27% lower order share milker typically, and that was about all we saw for a long time, other than a farm manager, of course. And you'll recall the milk price went through the roof, and the whole process and system changed, the mechanics changed, and we wound up with contracts that really could be anything to anyone. There was no, and still is no, sort of fixed formula. Every contract tends to have its own unique elements in it. But the starting point for that was really the bottom line. And by the bottom line, I mean the cash dropping out the bottom. And I think when the payout went through the roof a long time ago, there was clearly a lot more money being paid from farm owners. I'm assuming the hosts, the audience here is also contract milkers and farm owners, but there was clearly a lot more money changing hands than perhaps was originally intended. And relative to the value or cost of farm management, the focus became, okay, well, how much money is dropping out of the bottom? And then essentially reverse budgeting and getting to the point where you got to a contract structure that reflected the time and effort and responsibility and all those other things fairly. And it's probably also a fair observation that finance generally, for particularly new entrants, has got a little harder to source. There's no doubting that. We could go to the next slide if you like. So why consider it? The brief was specifically on contract milking, but there's any number of reasons why, and they tend to fall into one of those three reasons there. It tends to also be within each of those three a function of who controls what, and an alignment. And by alignment we mean that contract milkers and farm owners are setting out on the journey with a common view and a common understanding. It's really important that that's established at the outset. And the other point here is that typically in getting started contract milking, there's a little less capital to outlay, perhaps in some gear, tractor, feed wagon, and that might be about it, aside from some working capital. But the three reasons tended to be sort of around retention of staff, where you've got really good, capable people on farm who are wanting to get ahead and you're reliant on them. They might be a key person, as Ash and Josh pointed out, and you want to retain them in the business. And this is one mechanism or way of supporting them, but also keeping them in your business. And look, some farm owners will have the capacity, the ability to help make that happen. Not all. The next point there, or the next reason, might be around progression. Often that's again younger people trying to get ahead in the industry. It's a first step for them, often out of farm management, and it's really a case of taking the reins, running your own business, and effectively trying to build up some cash, get some cash in front of you, particularly as you're getting towards the end of seasons. And often that's used for working capital to fund your way through into the next season. And that contract could be quite different again. Succession is the third reason. And look, within a family business, again, this can be a mechanism to try and pass some responsibility, some ownership, and pass that on to the next generation. So that often requires, as noted there, a separate trading entity that might sit over the top of the farm ownership entity, so that some of the responsibilities can be handed over with some of the financial gain as well. And look, those ownership structures can be what we call joint ventures or equity partnerships, where there's differing stakes in the same business, different shareholdings and levels of ownership. So look, they tend to be the sort of three things or three reasons why we see contract milking being discussed. You can probably go to the next slide there, Louise, if you like. A few things just to think about. These are a little random, but as I said before, it's not about the bank. It's not about Rabobank or any other bank, because you won't get a bank if there isn't an element of trust first and foremost, and that's reciprocal. Obviously, you need to be able to trust your advisors, your bankers. Equally, they need to have confidence in you and your ability to deliver on what you have essentially promised. I've made a comment there, HP is evil. I don't think there's any other hire purchase providers presenting tonight. There might be in the audience, but it certainly has a use, it has a purpose, but it's also can be easy to get carried away with. And for bank managers pulling into a contract milker, potential contract milker's property, and the driveway's full of jet skis or big flash trucks and a whole lot of other stuff, then generally not a good look. The sort of warning signs come thick and fast. But gear is necessary. However, it loses your money every time. No one has got ahead by buying heaps of tractors and heaps of feed wagons and heaps of quad bikes. That's not how it works. You need to know what you need, what you're asking for. So being really clear about the essential items and the costs of those. And you need to understand your business as well and be able to convey what you're up to that prospective bank manager, whoever that might be. By that I mean how you're running the business and all those elements within it. And when you're really confident and sitting at the table, you've got to be prepared to negotiate as well. So with a good supportive farm owner, that'll be easy, and it might just be a case of working through different scenarios or questions that you might have, and getting to the point where you can mutually agree on what's fair and equitable reward. But you do have to be prepared to do that. Within the contracts themselves, as I alluded to before, there is now a massive range of them. Contract milking, I've noted there at the top of the list, is relatively simple. That generally progresses, and these sort of tend to be in a loose order into a lower order share milking arrangement potentially, and then you might move into a herd owning variable order contract where you've got an element of stock ownership, or next on the list is owning stock outside of that agreement, but with some leasing options either on farm or off farm. And then you wind up with hybrid contracts, combinations of the two. There might be some fixed payment elements within the same contract, and then a variable percentage reward for another proportion of essentially the same milk and the same work within the season. Payment structures, how that money actually changes hands, can obviously differ as well a lot. And again, I've noted control really being one of the key elements there. Things to think about, and we might have skipped forward one slide there, but that payment structure is often one where we're able to provide support in a different way, and again, I think the previous slide would show that it won't necessarily always be banks. It could be trade accounts, it could be stock agents, could be the bank of mum and dad, I think I called it, could be supportive farm owners, and even could be the detail to the right, which is a figured loan, you know, from an accounting software or accountant themselves. The payment structure one is an interesting one because from a farm owner's perspective, being able to help by providing regular fixed sums throughout the season, and you'll note that there's 11 sums of $20,000 paid the 15th or the 20th of the month, with a final wash up in May based on what the actual production done is, can be one way of helping with early season working capital where a bank might not be able to, but perhaps a farm owner who receives the milk check can. And that would be based on a proportion of the projected milk production, and it might be around 85%. And then, as I said, when you get to the end of the year and you know what your final wash up is, that last payment in May shows 40,000. That can then be used as your working capital into the next season to fund that early winter, typically sort of peak overdraft demand period through to September, October, when the milk checks really start coming in. So there's a couple of examples of different funding sources and payment structures that are all sort of ways to kick off your career, if you like, or your first business in a contract milking sense. You can go to the next slide there, Louise. And look, I think the FMG boys there, and obviously the people in the top of the North Island will be wondering what happens when it doesn't go to plan. And those photos are of a mate's farm in Auckland right now. And so, yep, the milking shed in the top right-hand corner is full of water. The cows can't go through it. And the FMG boys covered off that nicely earlier on. But you do have to plan for a downside. The bottom graph shows obviously the range of milk price over time, going up and down, and knowing how that impacts your business is really important. Planning for it is equally as well. Next slide, please. So the progression really can be based, I suppose, on what risk you can afford to take. And the farm manager example, which I think had an average salary of 88,000 that was just shown earlier, really is risk-free to a certain extent. To become a contract milker, you're assuming risk, and it's really production risk only, as opposed to production and payout risk that would apply to a percentage or variable order contract. That production risk and the additional income it generates over a farm manager salary for you is really subjective. I've called it the sort of risk premium down the bottom. And when you ask people how much more they want to get paid than a farm manager for assuming that production risk, taking on staff and you know, kicking off their own business, you'll get a range of answers. And look, that can be anything from $30,000 to $60,000 a year more as a bottom line than they'd get in a zero risk option. But really, it's also a case of what you can afford. With that bow wave of cash and with some progress made in a contract milking arrangement, your next step might be that you feel you can take on some payout risk. The slide before showed how variable that can be, but also what the reward might be if the payout goes the right way. And being an employer is risky in itself, potentially. The rate reflects responsibility, but not just that alone. can also, so by rate I mean the actual contract rate paid per kilogram of milk solids, and again it can be anything. I've seen 90 cents to $1.60 per kilo, but it's really based on farm infrastructure and the efficiencies of running that particular property. Your experience where that property is located, and that might have implications on how easy it is to get staff, which might have implications on your wage bill, which might mean that your rate per kilo needs to reflect that. You might also have future options on the table, perhaps with that farm or others, or farmer or owner or others, that also incentivize you to stay, and perhaps even incrementally that rate per kilo might increase based on how you progress over time. But ultimately you need to know what your time is worth as well, because when we talked about that bottom line in that first slide and the money dropping out the bottom, that should really also include your personal remuneration, how much your time is worth, taken out of those costs, along with the things that you'd normally incur, your fertilizer and your, or perhaps for contract milkers it's more likely to be shed, chemical, rubberware, that sort of stuff. But ensuring you allow for the value of your time is really important before you get to that bottom line as well. So you need to know what you're worth. Save. It's pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to explain it too much more, but we're looking at cost structures now and they're going through the roof. Being able to maintain a cost structure is a discipline, and by cost structure I mean the farm working expenses per kilo of milk solids, drawings even out of the business, so personal drawings, what you're living on, capital items as well, but having a bank of cash is proof that you can do it, and having a goal in mind there as well. So who is on the bus? By that I mean who are you taking on the journey with you. Bank managers aside, you'll need accountants, potentially solicitors, insurers, and a range of other people, and they really need to understand where you're going in order to be able to help you. Next slide, please. A bit of inspiration for the end. Don't mistake the edge of the wheel rut for the horizon. So my point there is, when it's not going right and you're sort of down in the dumps and you're stuck in a rut potentially, that's not the horizon. It's something to get over and work past. The next slide might help as well, which is just a wee plug for when you do need to get off farm. There's a Surfing for Farmers near you somewhere. I hope that helps, and yeah, fire away, Louise.
Cool, thank you, Nick. Is that Chris Lewis that's on the Surfing for Farmers? Looks a lot like Chris Lewis.
Bruce Ware, I think, is on the board. I'm not sure who the guy to the left is. All right.
Oh, has a Chris Lewisy look. Okay, anyway, moving on. So thank you very much, Nick. Some really cool advice there. So just a reminder to pop your Q&A into a question into the Q&A box. I'm going to quickly whip through my stuff, but we'll have a quick Q&A session at the end. So for me, just some general advice about if you're heading into the end of the season. It may seem ridiculous, it's only the end of January, but there are some really important dates that you guys need to keep in mind, especially, let's pop this, out of the way, there we go. That by the end of February, if you are considering putting in your notice or they're ending the term with your contract milker, the notice must be given by the end of February. After the end of February, if both parties agree, the agreement can be terminated, but the other party doesn't have to agree to that. The same date applies to your maintenance notice. This must be received by the contract milker by the end of February, moving on or not. This is a list of maintenance duties that the contractor is required to complete by the end of each season to fulfill its obligations. Now, these could be they're not, doesn't relieve you from any other maintenance obligations, but it's just making sure that the contract milker or you as a contract milker are keeping on top of all those annual tasks that need to be completed as part of your contract. Next slide, please, Katie. If you are moving on, or you've got a contract milker that's moving on, this is a really good time to actually inspect all the accommodation early. One, to make sure you're hitting your insurance requirements of every 6 months, but to also assess what repairs or work that might need to be done before the new contract milker comes on board. This especially includes anything that needs an insurance claim, a tradie, any materials that could be ordered. All of those things are backed up, and that'll apply worse in rural areas. Do an assessment of feed on hand. Now this could change. We could definitely still have major change in conditions. We're seeing some crazy rain. We're seeing a lot of dry down south. So, but make a plan if there's going to be a deficit of feed for the new contract milker. The sooner you buy feed, the cheaper it is, which you guys all know. Make sure that the NATE and dairy records are up to date. NATE is really hot on reminding us to remind you that to call to get your NATE records done now, not in May. They get a massive influx of calls in May, and it puts a lot of pressure on them. So make sure they're sorted in time, well in time for the new contract milker to come on board. Is there anything in the cow shed, other capital repairs or maintenance that needs to be done, that needs a specialist? Make sure that's all booked and ready to go. Next slide, Katie. If you're staying on, this is a really, really good point in time to revise and update your figures. We know, especially this last couple of seasons, expenses have gone crazy and things may have been quite unexpected, but become quite permanent. So especially things like the immigration labour rate and those costs. If milk soil is produced, have a good look at how that's going. The contract milking rate may need to be revised, and it's a good moment to do it, and get your budgets and cash flows up to date. The best way to do all of this is to use the business ownership premium to make sure it's still sufficient, is to do it through the Dairy NZ contract milking budget calculator. It's available on their website, and it's really easy to find if you just type it into Google. And start planning for next season, revising your goals and targets. Now, these are not your financial ones as such, but they might be a big deal for you, a deal breaker for you as a farm owner, or deal breaker for you as a contract milker. And that can be your own calf rate, the feed management. What could be done better? Start having those conversations now and start putting a plan in place to achieve them. It's quite hard to start doing this in June, and often that work needs to start happening well ahead of time. Next slide, please. If you're starting a new job before you sign, and farm owners, also make sure you're kind of encouraging this. Contract milkers, you need to be booking your appointments with all your support people, those people that are on your bus, before collecting your contracts, so that you can see them immediately to utilise the expertise. Farm owners really need you to be returning this in a timely manner, but you've got a lot to do in that time. So things you need to be checking: is that contract complete? Have you checked the remuneration with the Dairy NZ contract milking budget calculator? Have you correctly done your budget and cash flows? Have you got sign off from the bank that any lending is required to be okay? Have you got any legal questions or queries, and your other things? Have you got your insurance quote? Have you spoken to your accountant? Do you have an accountant? Do you understand your business structure? All those bits and pieces need to be covered off before you sign that contract. Next slide, Katie. Before starting a new job, now these things do have to happen before you start, but they're good things to get on top of soon. Obtaining your insurance, including the cover that's required in the contract. Preparing the health and safety policy with the owner. This can take a bit of time and a bit of toing and froing. The sooner you have it in place, the better. Put in place a drug and alcohol policy, and that applies farm-wide. And it may be toward you, the farm owner, and your employees. If possible, and if farm owners, if you can allow this to happen, it can really benefit you. Inspect the accommodation, buildings and structures to identify any repairs that you need ahead of time as well. This is within the contract that it must be done within 28 days of the contract commencing, but the sooner you do it ahead of time, it gives everyone more time to get it complete. Inspect livestock, farm and feed to ensure everything is as provided for, or will be as provided for in the contract. Do this again at the start of term, but definitely worth looking into now to have your best jump start if possible. Next slide, please, Katie. For farm owners, before a contract milker starts, make sure you provide the contract milker with the following. Now, these are actually in the tick list at the front of the contract milking agreement and are required under the contract milking agreement as well. Farm policy. I've actually had a number of queries of people that haven't had a farm policy in place and have been kind of just muddling through. Farm policies can really take a lot of the grey area out. Biosecurity plan. The plan of the land to what actually is in the area, and especially things like where the calf grazing is going to be, the calf rearing activity, so they can start planning what kind of calf trailers they're going to need and a calf rearing plan. Any farm environment plan and nutrient management plan, up-to-date soil tests if you have them, the water use and water quality records, anything they need to know there, any other test results, compliance conditions, and that the accommodation checklist and healthy home statement are complete. Before the contract milker starts, also make sure that you've removed all the rubbish from the farm, obtained any insurance cover as required by the agreement. The feed status in the agreement is on farm, or you've got a plan in place. And now that's with contract milker agreement. The best way to do that, if you are going to be in a position that you are going to be short on feed, or that you're actually going to have more, the best thing to do is actually sit down and talk it through and make revisions. That you completed your NATE stock take. Don't take it as the contract milker that is leaving has got it completely perfect. I hear a lot of the time when contract milkers start and records are a mess, it takes them a really long time to get it sorted. And that the rubberware, other materials, equipment is in the agreed condition and good to go. Last season, I got a lot of queries on rubberware that was not sorted. Next slide, Katie. I think that is it from me. So if we pop everyone back in, sorry, that was a quick run through. There is going to be a tick list that's going to come out when the recording is ready, just to help everyone with that. Okay, if you've got any questions, make sure you pop them in the question box. But to kick off, Ash, do you have any examples of key person cover? So what kind of premium would you expect to pay for what level of protection?
Yeah, sure. So I'll base it on just quite a average sort of amount. So it is looking at about 5,000 a month, and that sort of gives you near to a competent labour to sort of come in and support you during the time of sickness or injury and allow that contract to be supported while you are recovering. So it's about 5,000 a month for a 20-year-old male for a 1-year benefit period. So a benefit period, what it means is that tomorrow, if you became sick and injured, sick or injured, it'd be horrible if you do it both, sick or injured, that means that you would be able to get paid for a year. So that's at 5,000 a month that will last a year. So there are other sort of benefit periods. These are the 2 years, which really depends on where you see your contingency plan. Is it to fulfill the contract or whatever? So I'll base it on a year. So 5,000 a month for a year benefit period. For a 20-year-old is about $102 per month. For a 30-year-old male, it's about 102 as well. So from 20 to 30, it's about 102. And for a 40-year-old, it's about 40-year-old male is about $131. For a 20-year-old female, it's about $141. Same as a 30-year-old female as well, 141. For a 40-year-old female, it's about 184. And so that's around this sort of kind of a average or a projection what it could cost. But there's a lot of factors that can go in. If you're a smoker, unfortunately, you are rated higher. And there are sort of different things, part of your medical conditions. But that's just a rough sort of estimate what it could cost.
Cool, but for a decent long period, that's a good year of cover to make sure you are covered in those situations. And we do hear of them really frequently. Josh, with the public liability cover sitting at the $2 million as in the contract, what are the things you could be paying for with that sum? Because that's a lot of money.
Yes, that $2 million is a lot of money, but equally it does disappear just as quick. So what you can actually use that for, so if your stock are on the road and say a tanker hits your stock, hits your cows, so you could use that public liability to pay for the damage to the tanker. And then obviously there's damaged milk in there. Some other farmers' milk you've damaged in there, so you can use for that. Then the cleanup costs as well. So you've got that $2 million there, you know, with the way inflation, everything's all sitting. Those tankers are sitting around that 700K mark now, 700 to 800K. So if you kind of work on that, the $2 million does allow it to happen kind of twice in a season. We'd hope no one ever gets to that situation, but that's what you can use it for. There's obviously legal fees and things that can come into that as well. If it does end up going down that road, fingers crossed it doesn't. But that's kind of where the $2 million does kind of disappear to or get used up in. It does sound big and scary to start with, but once you understand a little more, it makes a bit more sense.
And what kind of cost you're looking at. And I wonder if you had another goods truck or something like that had totally different product in it that would begin to add up really quickly.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And things like how common are accidental breaches like effluent spillage? Do you see that quite commonly from contract milkers?
I wouldn't say it's really common, but it does happen. Unfortunately, we're in insurance, so we do see the worst, unfortunately. But, you know, for a contract milk, your biggest risk is around potentially the spreading of the effluent. You know, you've set the effluent spread again, and then you've had a cow go down or something else happen, you've completely forgotten about it, got to the end of the run, and, you know, it's just end up the whole of pooling, your neighbours reported you. And that's where your contract milker risks sit. You know, as a farm owner, they're generally responsible for the maintenance side of things if the plant fails again, generally. But that's where we see it as a contract milker. In terms of actual claims, you know, there wouldn't be, we might have, say, 4 in the Waikato, so that's where I operate in a season. And that's just around that effluent breach. Obviously, health and safety. You don't see too many in there, but there is, with all the checks and that are going on, there is kind of a few more starting to appear. But health and safety plans are getting really, really good. But yeah, it's all on an individual farm scenario, and you know, it's just something that you work through and do talk through with whoever you get you to sort your insurance.
Thank you, Josh. Ash, one question here. Why is the women's cover so much more expensive? And I was actually thinking the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. I knew I was going to get asked that. So it is throughout sort of history. They look at rating it based on the number of claims that has come out, the number of conditions that have you know, gone through claims. And one of the interesting stats is that unfortunately sometimes males don't actually claim because they forget they actually have some sort of cover in place. So the claim stats sort of impact that as well. So it's one is conditions, medical conditions that have been claimed on, and 2 was just the amount of times it's sort of been risked. So it's the more claims have happened throughout history. Unfortunately, that's why they've rated it higher. But when you look at it,
event too efficient.
Yes, exactly. They know what they have and they claim on it. So well done. But my biggest thing is that, you know, once you're going into the seasons, to make sure that you've got this in place, and look at sort of options as well. So yeah, make sure to call through.
Cool. A question for Nick. What can someone that actually has quite a bit of hire purchase do in that scenario to clean up their act and get ready for contract milking?
Well, the answer is let's try and get rid of it. That said, there is a need, or there is a purpose for it. It does have a use, and if that asset that is on hire purchase is for the farm operation, it's actually for the farm business as opposed to personal good times, then look, that might not be an issue. You've got to have a tractor, and if that's how it's funded, that's fine. And if the impact on, most importantly, cash flow is negligible or manageable, then, you know, that's just part of the mix. But they tend to be short term by their very nature and would be repaid reasonably smartly anyway. Just got to be confident that you can do it, and that the asset that you have funded that way is critical to the business. So no sort of one answer fits all, I'm afraid. But in short, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have them, but there is a use and there is a time for them.
Cool, thank you, Nick. On when you were talking about the business premium or the risk premium, but also working out how much time your time is worth, how do you work out how much more your time is worth as a contract milker, as a share milker, compared to a manager?
This is a classic that I've seen time and time again over my career. When you ask a farmer what their time's worth, they pretty much default to what that person might be doing, or the task that they might be doing that the farm owner or contract milker would have been doing otherwise. So, for example, they default to what a tractor driver salary or wage or hourly rate might be, when in actual fact, often they're running large businesses with a lot of time invested and a lot of money, and their value is significantly more because they could be spending the time making strategic decisions, working on the business, not in it, as they say. So the answer is not what the lowest possible wage or salary or hourly rate might be for someone doing whatever the task is you're doing. It's for what the potential gain or potential loss of that time, the opportunity cost of that time is. Again, tough to answer. The other way to look at it is in terms of valuing your time, how much money you're taking out of the business, your personal drawings, what a fair reward for that might be in another context, another job, another industry perhaps, but also what's required to support your family. So it's so subjective, it's not funny, but
yeah, definitely. Also, there's a question here. I'm going to add a little bit, but what are some of the things that farm owners could actually be doing to help contract milkers with their cash flow, especially in their first seasons?
Yeah. I think I understand where you're going. It's about the support and about the support up front to get started, right? And one of my previous slides there showed how different payment structures can be used to help kick that off, where a farm owner is able to do so, and not everyone is, or not everyone necessarily is inclined to, but that is one way. Alternatively, the other things are, for example, guarantees. That's probably less common. And look, I think, I've also seen payments deferred. So where there is reimbursements to farm owners, and they've got capacity to wear that cost perhaps for another month or two, they might be able to push that reimbursement out to ease that early season cash flow, so that you're not peaking early on when you've got no income. That's another way of doing it. Look, it really depends on what mutual agreement those two parties can get to.
On that kind of cash flow, especially the early season, what are some of the things that contract milkers need to be thinking about when it comes to actually asking about overdrafts? So planning for overdraft and overdraft expenditure.
Yeah, you mentioned it, I think, in your summary, and I didn't specifically touch on it, but clearly budgets and cash flows sort of as a given. I assume that everyone sort of knew that. And look, that accurate forecasting, that realistic forecasting, provides the outline or the framework for what funding we need to put in place. Without that, we're flying blind. So the first thing I'd say is have a really robust, conservative, potentially forecast that we can work around realistically to determine what working capital is needed. Does that help?
Yeah, and probably just also potentially considering the additional cost of going back for more overdraft, because that's not free, right? That's a additional cost that you pay for.
Yeah. Unfortunately, banks aren't charities, and money costs. Yep. So working capital is, aside from credit cards, probably one of the most expensive forms of funding you'll get. Making sure that is, as I said, accurate and realistic will help minimise those costs. Yeah, and having to go back and ask for more, for sure.
And just kind of final one for Nick before I wrap up. But What are the chances of becoming a contract milker or getting finance even with no savings and have current existing loans?
So, but yeah, well, their existing loans must be for something, unless they are personal loans that were advanced for, for anything other than a productive asset. I suppose the point being, you might have a loan which funds an asset, which might provide some security. And as I said, machinery is necessary, but you'll lose money on it every time, and it's no good for security. I don't think many banks would look at it and lend anything against it specifically. That's the realm of finance companies or the machinery dealers. Again, that might be relevant and have a place. It would be tough, but it's not impossible. Again, you might have to lean on support or look at what options there are around payment structures to try and minimise that funding requirement up front. But just because you've got a loan doesn't mean you're not going to get underway contract milking. It's probably a case of what that loan funded and what other support there might be around it. Equally, often we're making calls about someone's ability. We lend to people first and foremost, and with a good track record and really capable, proven operators who have got a clear understanding of where they're going and can convey that with plans in place. Look, everything can be discussed and considered. We'd need to make those calls on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so not impossible,
but not impossible. Probably tougher. Depends what the loan was for.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, I want to thank our speakers tonight, Ash, Joshua, and Nick. Thank you very much for your time and joining us, and thank you everyone for attending. If you do have any questions, you all have my email address, and if they're for one of our team here, I will be happy to pass them on. But thank you everyone, and have a good night.